The tall man, with ashen skin and dark, shoulder-length hair, sat on the dirty floor in the cavity of a wall, his head resting in his hand. For a little over 1,000 years, Finian Lancaster had protected St. Cuthbert's Abbey in London against thieves, pillagers, murderers and marauders after he had died unexpectedly at the age of 22. But for the last 2 decades, he had been unsure of his purpose in life. For the last 100 years, the Abbey had sat abandoned, not a soul venturing into it, except for rats, spiders, and the occasional curious creature. That changed about a decade ago, when a not insignificant number of men began to appear in the building, tearing up floors and knocking down walls. Finian watched it all silently, occasionally sticking his head through the walls so he could see what was happening. It took a good year, but when it was all done, Finian was surprised to see his old abbey had been converted into a large manor house or a tenement. And soon after that, people of all ages began to take up residence in the various rooms that now spread through the abbey. None of these new residents were holy men, however. Instead, they were single men and single women, and even one couple with a wee baby. At first, it was all very strange, but it didn't take long for Finian to grow accustomed to the new sounds. The music, the loud voices, even the crying baby, who could be heard over the couple trading barbs late at night. Finian frowned, thinking back to one dark, stormy night after all the new people had moved in when he heard a woman screaming. The noise was muted, but it was clear enough to him that someone close by had to be in the midst of a terrible battle. Finian moved quickly through the walls, corporealizing in the room a few feet off the floor, just as he had done hundreds of times in the past, the element of surprise on his side. When he emerged, however, he was shocked to see a young woman and a man sitting on a large cushioned settee, half buried under a thick blanket, staring up at him, shock and confusion etched on their faces. He frowned as he remembered looking about the room for signs of violence, only to realise the sounds were coming from a large box projecting quite detailed images across it. He blinked in the semi-darkness, the glare of the screen making it hard for him to see details, but it was clear enough to him that the screaming was merely theatre. His back was turned to the couple, but he abruptly turned as the woman threw the blankets off and began to yell at him. Finian was quite surprised at how quickly she moved, falling over the back of the cushioned bench as the man who had been sitting next to her remained stunned in place, silent as the grave. His frown turned to a scowl, remembering the feeling of confusion as he frantically looked around for blood or dismembered bodies. But sadly there were none. There was only the frightened man and the angry woman who had already thrown a book at him and was in the process of reaching for what looked to be rather a large serving bowl, prompting him to disappear back into the wall. It had been 10 years since that puzzling night, and he could honestly say that he never made that mistake again. And that young woman he so rudely intruded upon 10 years ago, it turned out that her name was Evie Burton, and, to this day, she still lived in the same room in the northwestern corner of the second floor. Over the years, Finian had heard her call out to him, saying things like, "Hey, Mr. Ghost, are you still around?" Of course, Finian never responded. That wasn't who he was. Times had changed. Finian had to admit this. It had been several hundred years since he had to defend one of the monks. But this was his immortal life now, and he had to come to terms with it, as dreary, boring, and uneventful as it was. But one night it all changed. As he had done for 1,000 years, Finian was sitting in the cavity in the stone wall, always attentive, always listening for sounds of mayhem and murder. This particular night started off quietly, but there was one voice that kept repeating what sounded almost like a discordant song. It was coming from Evie's apartment. As the night wore on, Finian could hear the chant more clearly, and, try as he might to avoid it, it pulled him physically towards Evie's room. In one final moment, as the chanting crescendoed, Finian corporealized in the very same room he had burst into a decade ago, this time floating just over a small dark wooden table. He saw Evie and another woman sitting in chairs, staring up at him, their mouths agape. Finian looked around. The woman sitting across from Evie was wearing a long white floral print dress with long sleeves that flared at the end. Her hair was pulled tightly back into a ponytail, and Finian could see her large round earrings glitter in the light from the multiple candles set about the room. The woman blinked twice, shook her head, and said to Evie, "I can't believe this actually worked." Evie paused before blurting out, "I told everyone you're real, but they told me I was crazy." Finian returned Evie's gaze. He tried to speak, but there were no words. "He's trying to say something," said Evie. "What's he saying?" The woman looked up at Finian before returning her gaze to Evie. She said, I don't know." Finian felt his body shudder as he tried to will himself back towards the wall, but nothing happened. He was tethered to an object on the table, a small black leather-bound book that lay open. His head shot back, and he tried to cry out, but there was only silence. "You're hurting him," insisted Evie. Finian looked down again, his head going back and forth between the two women. "You have to stop this," she said, grabbing the woman's hand. "Please, we're hurting him." The woman pulled the book towards her and began to flip through the pages. Finian watched as she lifted her head to face him, waved her hand over the book and said, "I release you." Nothing happened. Evie rolled her eyes. "I thought you said you knew what you were doing." "I do," the woman answered. I think. Evie and Finian locked eyes just as he felt the searing pain again. He forced a smile at her and mouthed the words, "I'm all right." He watched as Evie wiped the tears collecting in her eyes before he noticed movement coming up through the table right next to the book. At first it was just a hand, pale and ghostly like his, but it was monstrously deformed. Dirty white skin pulled taut over skeletal fingers that ended in long broken nails. Right after that, a second ghoulish hand broke the surface, digging its claws into the table. Ever so slowly, the arms parted, and a head popped up through the table. Its bright red eyes focused on the woman across from Evie, who was still engrossed in the book, reading aloud from it. Finian watched helplessly as the creature pulled itself through the top of the table so that half its body was now free. He could see its mouth framed by cracked and broken teeth, opening and closing slowly, a long hideous tongue flicking across its thin pale lips. Evie stood up and screamed, her chair tumbling to the ground. The other woman, however, was much too slow. She looked up in confusion to see the pallid creature reach out with its long, thin arm before she could pull away, wrapping its hand around her throat, driving its nails into her neck, and squeezing with a loud, crunching sound. Her head rolled to the side, and she slumped to the floor as the fiend released her. Its mouth parted, and it began to lick its fingers with its chalky white tongue. It then turned lazily towards Evie, its neck making hideous popping and creaking noises as it went. Finian wasn't exactly sure what was happening. Maybe the woman's death had broken the magic that had held him in place. But whatever it was, the 1,000-year-old Grim found himself able to move once again, and he wasted no time drawing his long sword from the sheath on his belt. While the monstrous creature's attention was focused on Evie, he drove the sword right through its lower back and lifted up with both hands until it broke free through its shoulder, the sound of breaking bones filling the small room. Following that, Finian kicked the beast in its right side, driving it away from Evie, and, with a sweeping blow, brought his sword down on its left side, snapping through its partially exposed collarbone and cracking at least 3 of its ribs. The monstrosity fell hard to the floor, both of its arms rendered useless from the previous blows. Finian stepped up to it as its mouth repeatedly opened and snapped shut in a feeble attempt to bite him. Both hands he brought the sword down on its neck, severing its head from its body. Finian knelt down next to the creature's head, but before he could get a better look at it, it dissolved into the wood floor, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. He looked over at Evie, who had slumped to the floor, her head in her hands. He could hear at least 2 men at her door, banging on it and shouting for her by name. As the door came crashing in, Finian willed himself back into the wall, leaving the living to deal with the mortal affairs. The Grim disappeared, back to the stone cavity, where he would remain until the day came that his services were needed once again.